friends, in the series which we are doing on history of India from 1700 to 1950, today we will talk about British expansion and consolidation, and in that context we will talk about Marathas today. In the earlier lectures we talked about that how when the British they came to India initially as traders and how they consolidated their rule in India over a period of time, initially by meddling in the affairs of the various Indian princely states and kingdoms. And in that context how they started with Carnatic wars, and thereafter we see that they set their eyes on Bengal and they interfered in the affairs of the Bengal, and thereafter we see that they were able to in a way establish their authority in that particular region. In the context of the Marathas also we find that how Marathas they were a dominant force in the Indian history, and how they also in a way helped the Mughal ruler in maintaining his control over the Mughal territories, and their tactics as well as the kind of strength which was displayed by the Marathas, and how they were able to carve out an empire for themselves was also an important phase of the Indian history. So, in that context when we see how the British when they came to India and when they realized that Marathas they were a force to reckon with, and how they have to handle them, and various wars they were also being fought with the Marathas, and over a period of time they were able to in a way exercise their control over them as well. So, in this context we will try to understand that how British the kind of tactics which were being used by the British in their wars with the Marathas, and as we know that how British they used a lot of treachery and bribery which was being used by the British. Many a times it has also been argued that British they had far better military, and then also the people those who were serving the British at that point of time they were far abler men than the Maratha generals, but these kinds of things they have been rejected in the recent historiography like Randolph Cooper and others. They have rejected these kinds of argument, and the revisionist historiography in a way rejects the ideas of Eurocentrism and military determinism which were being in a way practiced by the colonial historians or the historians those who were trying to in a way suggest that British they were far more superior than the Marathas. So, such kind of studies which are largely talking about the specific wars etc., they try to communicate these kinds of ideas in the new light where we where it has been communicated that the traditional reasons which have been given with regard to the victory of the British they have been wrong, rather specific wars they need to be studied, and the strength of the Maratha forces need to be recognized along with the generals those who were there, and many of the wars many times were very close in that sense, and even Marathas could have won them. And in this framework when we tend to understand the Marathas or their contribution to this particular phase, we realize that they made some kind of a remarkable contribution to the Indian history. With regard to the readings, one can talk about Randolph Cooper's Anglo-Maratha campaigns and the contest for India, the struggle for the control of the South Asian military economy, then the IGNOU source material, and B.L. Grover and S. Grover's new look at the modern Indian history. So, these are some of the readings which one can refer when one is talking about Marathas. And when we tend to see the Anglo Maratha relations, that how these kinds of relations which existed between the Marathas and the British, and we find that 1775 to 1782 that was the period when we find the first Anglo-Maratha war, and that was also the period when we find that after the death of Narayan Rao, who was the Peshwa, Raghunath Rao or the Raghoba, he wanted to be the Peshwa in place of Narayan Rao, and he sought help from the British, and finally we find that Madhav Rao Narayan he became the Peshwa in the Treaty of Salbai and in which we find that the Celsit was confirmed for the British. So that was signed, and British got nearly 20 years to consolidate their position because of the fact that we find that after this no war was fought between the British and the Marathas as late as 1802-03. When we find in British, they had this kind of a time, 20 years, to consolidate their rule in other regions. So when we tend to understand these kinds of relations, we find that at this point of time also British, they wanted to support one party as they had done in other wars as well, and then they wanted to see concessions from them, and because of this kind of a treaty which was between the British and the Marathas, we find that they were able to secure some kind of a peace for themselves. And we also see that when this period ended, then they had some kind of a conflict again with the Maratha forces, and we find that the Treaty of Bassein in 1802, 31st December, with the Peshwa was signed by the British, and the Peshwa agreed for receiving a permanent regular native infantry in his territories, which was one of the standard practices in those times. We find that Lord Wellesley, who had come as Governor General, and his tactics of the subsidiary alliance system, because of which many native states they came under the colonial rule. And we find that in this the Peshwa had to cede territory yielding an income of rupees 26 lakhs, and the Peshwa also surrendered the city of Surat as well. And we find that the other conditions of this treaty, when you talk about them, that Peshwa had no claim for the Chauth and Nizam's dominions on the dominions of the Nizam, and not to resort to arms against Gaikwad. So these kinds of restrictions, they were being placed in this particular treaty, and we also find that in this one of the provisions was with regard to that Peshwa neither to commence nor pursue in future any negotiations with any power without giving previous notice and entering into mutual consultation with East India Company. So the company's power became more dominant, and how Peshwa had to in a way seek permission of the company. He had to provide some kind of a prior notice to the East India Company. And we also find that Peshwa during this time agreed to the East India Company's arbitration in all different between all the kinds of differences which were there between him and Nizam or Gaikwad. So we find that the personal rights in that sense, or they were in a way surrendered by the Peshwa to the British, and British now they had comparatively more power in terms of deciding about these kinds of relations which existed between the East India Company and the Marathas. And when you talk about that, how Bassein, the Treaty of Bassein played an important role in that context, we can see that British influence was also settled at or established at Pune because of this. And when you talk about the other Maratha Sardars or chiefs, they were being reduced to a similar position of subordination to the East India Company. And we find that how East India Company became some kind of an arbitrator in the disputes between the Peshwa and the others, and we find that how East India Company in an advantageous position, and troops they were being placed at Mysore, Hyderabad, Lucknow and Pune. So such kind of events, they were to the advantage of the East India Company, and we find that in different Indian states how they were able to place the troops and which were at the disposal of the East India Company, and these troops they were also used by the East India Company for furthering their aims. And we find that how East India Company, when it entered into various kinds of treaties with the other rulers as well. And when they were fighting wars with the number of Maratha Sardars, and how East India Company defeated Bhosle, and the Treaty of Devgaon was signed in 1803, as you can see on the screen as well. And Scindia defeated, and the Treaty of Surjit was again signed in 1803, and with Holkar the Treaty of Rajpur Ghat was signed in 1805. So we find that how there were some kind of changes in their relations with the Marathas, and how Marathas when they were dealing with the East India Company, and then we find that they had to sign a number of treaties with them. And when one is talking about that how when these kinds of wars they were being fought between the East India Company as well as the Marathas, then we find that a number of generalized causes they have been talked about with regard to the defeat of the Marathas, and many times it has also been argued that their leadership was inept in nature, and how the leaders, those who were leading the Maratha forces, whether it was Peshwa Bajirao II or Daulat Rao Sindhya, they were engaged in number of misdeeds. And it was also been argued that Peshwa Bajirao II had a criminal stain in his character, and how he drove away the Maratha Sardars, those who were rallying behind him. And it has also been argued that Daulat Rao Sindhya was a lover of luxury, and because of which these people and their character, a lot of misrule, oppression, plunder and devastation was there. So when such kinds of reasons they have been given, and personal kind of attacks they are being made on the generals, one can also argue that these leaders won them in different battles as well. And with regard to only the British, a number of British officials, they were also engaged in a lot of bribery, they were also living a life of luxury in India. And but despite that they were successful, because their tactics, rather the kind of treachery which they were doing in the various battles which they fought, it became more, it was more pronounced later to the Indian mind, but at that point of time it was not all that pronounced as well. But when we tend to understand that these kinds of reasons or the causes they have been given with regard to the defeat of the Marathas, that how some of the eminent leaders, those who were there in the Maratha kingdom, and how they died over a period of time from 1794 onwards till 1800. And with their death we find that whether it was Mahadji Scindia or Haripant Phatke or Ahilyabai Holkar, Peshwa Madhav Rao, Tukoji Holkar and Fadnavis, all of them they perished from 1794 to March 1800. And with their departure, with their death, we find that Maratha kingdom also suffered. If they would have been there with their skills, their strength and their acumen, they would have furthered the cause of the Marathas, but that did not happen because they died. So it was one of the reasons which has been attributed by some of the scholars with regard to the defeat of the Marathas in the various battles which were in a way fought by them against the British. So when we tend to in a way understand that how the causes they have been rather generalized with regard to the Maratha state, for example, that the inherent weaknesses or the defects of the Maratha state, they have been argued that Marathas they were not organized, and the spread of education did not take place in the Maratha territory. People, they were not feeling united, and we also find that the cohesion of the people of the Maratha state was artificial and accidental. This has been argued by some of the scholars, those who have in a way talked about the defeat of the Marathas, and they tend to understand the Maratha history in not in a positive light. Rather they argue that there were a lot of differences between or among the Marathas and the state When you talk about its cohesion, then it was accidental and artificial in nature. So, when you talk about the other kinds of aspects with regard to the defeat of the Marathas in the various battles in which they fought, then we find that they did not have any kind of a stable economic policy, and how they were relying on chauth, which was around 20% of the money which was collected by them, and Sardeshmukhi, which was 10%. So, we find that how when you talk about these kinds of reasons, in that sense, then we find that they have been attributed for the Maratha defeat, and it has also been argued that they were not able to generate the internal resources, and apart from that, we also see that their political setup was also criticized, that it had a number of weaknesses, and it was merely a loose federation of the chiefs. And when you talk about the Maratha generals or the officials, they were carrying a number of jealousies and conflicts with each other, because of which we find that they were not able to secure victory. Rather, their dissensions amongst themselves led to the defeat of the Maratha Sardars in the various wars which were fought at that point of time. And when you talk about the military system, we find that how it was also criticized by many scholars, that how it was inferior to the opponents who were there. Their organization of the forces was not up to the mark, and in the war weapons also they were lagging behind, and they were also lagging in the disciplined action and the effective leadership. So, these are some of the generalized kinds of reasons which have been given with regard to the defeat of the Marathas, that how Marathas, they did not pay attention to their artillery, and they could have improved their artillery as well. And even when they adopted some of the weapons, so modern techniques of warfare, etc., then they were also inadequate in nature. So, that has also been criticized by the scholars. But one has to also in a way understand that if Marathas would have been successful, if they would have defeated the British, then such kinds of accusations or things, they would not have been mentioned as has been done by the European scholars. And we also see that how when you talk about British with regard to their success against the Marathas, then their diplomacy is being talked about, but this diplomacy was in the framework of the treachery or the bribery which was being given by the British to some of the people, those who were in the Indian state. So, we find that when you see East India Company, that how it was trying to win allies to themselves, and how they were diplomatically in a way isolating their enemies, but it was not in the framework of the situation of the war, but rather we find that they were indulging in such kind of unethical behavior, where they employed all sorts of means to achieve their ends. So, that was one of the concerns of that particular period, and we find that many times it is also being argued that when you talk about the espionage system, British, they had an excellent espionage system, and Marathas, they were not all that careful with regard to the military intelligence, and English learnt Marathi and they could also speak it. But with regard to Marathas, they in a way were not ready to make this kind of an effort to understand English. And when we find that British residents, they were being allowed to be kept in the court of the kingdom, at that point of time these British residents, they became dominant over a period of time. They started to interfere in the internal activities of the administration, and they were also carriers of information to the East India Company, because we find that they were in a way providing a lot of information to the British, because as they were staying in the particular state, so they had access, and they were also attending court. So they had access to a lot of information which could be useful to the British, and such kind of information was also provided to the British, which in a way also weakened the states in India. And we also see, when you talk about the military methods, for example, or the way understanding of the dissensions as well. So in that sense, we also have to realize that such kind of personality clash, etc., they were there in other parts of the world as well, and but in the Indian context, many of them, they were in a way over exaggerated. They were also being communicated in such a manner as if the British, they had some kind of a superior military tactics, or they were far better than the Indians. So such kinds of views, they have been rejected by the revisionist historians. They have tried to understand each battle on their own merit, and they have tried to find the deficiencies, if there were any, with regard to the British interpretation. And we find that such kind of interpretations had a lot of anomalies, they had a lot of prejudiced views, and many a times we find that no sincere kind of work was being done with regard to unearthing the sources about a particular thing which has been talked about. Rather, some kinds of generalized ideas, they were being imposed on others. And when we talk about the British, they are always being shown in a far better light, as if they had this kind of a progressive outlook, and they had undertaken a lot of sea voyages, so they were aware about other cultures, regions, etc., and how they were able to annex a number of colonies for themselves. And Marathas, they were being questioned with regard to that, how they were tied to their old dogma and the motions, etc. And on the other hand, British, they were also being seen as rational beings, and how during this particular period we find that it was the differences of the people, they were being pointed out, that Marathas, they had differences with the Brahmins, and how these differences they were there in the public as well. So such kind of ideas, where we find that British, they were being shown to be far more superior in terms of their outlook, in terms of their approach, in terms of their scientific kind of ideas. And on the other hand, we find that Indians, they were being shown in a negative light in this context, and we find that such a kind of prejudice, or such kind of preconceived notions with regard to the portrayal of the Indians, how they were perceived, or how they were being represented in the public sphere, and because of which we find that British, they were being seen, that how British, they were far more superior to the Indians. And these kind of ideas, they have been in a way not accepted by not only Indian scholars, many of the nationalist scholars, they have rejected the kind of ideas which have been propagated by the colonial rulers or the colonial historians. And the Indian scholars, they have come up with their own ideas with regard to the Marathas and British interaction. And in that context, when you talk about that, how British were trying to write the history of India from their own viewpoint, and how they try to understand the Indian society for their own personal and the benefit of the company, where we find that how the civil servants in India, they were being trained in a college, so that they are aware about Indian culture, they know about the Indian culture, so that it becomes easier for them to rule India. In this context, when you talk about the new scholars with their new fresh and ideas, we find that they have criticized the Eurocentric tendencies, that Europe is the center of the world, and that was not the case. Rather, we find that they have in a way questioned these kinds of Eurocentric assumptions. They have asked that, or they have shown that how Britain was not the center of the world, and these Eurocentric theories, they need to be questioned and they need to be in a way refuted by some kind of a solid research which tries to show that such kind of racial and such kind of racial as well as the preconceived notions regarding viewing the Indian society, they need to be changed, and they have definitely contributed, not only the nationalist historians but some of the European scholars also, they have, including Randolph G. Cooper, those who have rejected these kinds of ideas. And he says that when you talk about military determinism, that how a military would determine the course of the action and how the European military was far more superior, we need to consider these kinds of questions in the light of the fresh research, and we also have to see the cross cultural study of the political economy of war in South Asia. This has been argued by them, and we also see that these scholars, including Cooper, they combine an overview of the Maratha military culture with a battle by battle analysis of 1803 Anglo-Maratha campaigns. So we find that these scholars, they have in a way tried to see the situation from a different perspective. They have employed the different sets of skills to uncover the new interpretations of history, and with their attitude and approach and with the scientific use of their approaches, we find that they have given different kind of an interpretation to the whole situation. And when you talk about the expansionist ideas at this point of time, that how British they were expanding. So we will talk about these kinds of ideas in our next lecture, where we will talk about the expansion during the Marathas. Thank you very much.